We see a failure of the COP process. We see global leaders protecting the interests of the fossil fuel industry at the expense of small island nations and the future of all of our children and grandchildren. First of all, I want to thank Deputies Pringle, Connolly and Collins for this really excellent and timely motion. It aims to stop the current situation whereby public money is invested indirectly through ISIF in damaging fossil fuel investments and agribusiness in the global south. It highlights the role of Ireland as a conduit for literally billions of euros of investment in damaging fossil fuels. And in particular, I want to highlight the call for Ireland to take a lead in terms of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I think that demand in particular is extremely timely given the final text agreed at COP28, which emerged a couple of hours ago. For the 28th time, the news from COP is not good. We see a failure of the COP process. We see global leaders protecting the interests of the fossil fuel industry at the expense of small island nations and the future of all of our children and grandchildren. What we needed to have any hope of averting catastrophic climate collapse of 2 degrees or more of global heating was a cast iron commitment to a complete phase out of fossil fuels. But what we got was more of the same. More of the same hedging that tries to blur the distinction between ending fossil fuels and continuing them. More of the same diplomatic language that hides the sentencing to death of billions of people in the poorest countries in the world. More of the same polite fudges which cover over the destruction of a livable future for our children and grandchildren. I heard Minister Eamon Ryan on Morning Ireland this morning claiming that transitioning away from fossil fuels and phasing them out mean the same thing in his mind. But it doesn't matter what they mean in Eamon Ryan's mind. What matters is what they say in the text. That's why thousands of diplomats, thousands of lobbyists from oil and gas companies and big agri-food companies, and the 34 billionaires who flew to their talks on their private jets have been wrangling over this text for the last 2 weeks. It's because every word, every comma, every paragraph counts. So it matters that those who want to block action to stop fossil fuels, to phase out fossil fuels, won on that key question. The chair of the talks, Sultan Al Jaber, who was also the head of the UAE National Oil Company, certainly knew that when he presented such a joke of a first draft yesterday, that anything else would then be seen to be better by comparison, and the likes of Eamon Ryan could go on the media and greenwash what has been agreed in claiming we've a great compromise and an important step forward. But what does the text actually say? The crucial part is paragraph 28, which, quote, calls on parties to contribute to the following global efforts in a nationally determined manner, taking into account the Paris Agreement and their different national circumstances, pathways and approaches. How many get-out clauses are in that one sentence already? The small island states, which this agreement virtually guarantees will disappear under rising floodwaters, has labelled it a litany of loopholes. Calls on means that everything that follows is voluntary and not binding on a single country at the talks. What are the, quote, global efforts that countries are called on to contribute to? Quote, taking into account their different national circumstances, pathways and approaches. The first is, quote, accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power. So continuing to use coal. The dirtiest form of fossil fuels out there is fine, you just have to use less of it. That's what phase down rather than phase out means. And then the word unabated. So you just have to try to abate it, relying on the fiction of carbon capture and storage technologies that haven't been invented yet to take the carbon back out of the atmosphere after the coal has put it there. The US, which is the biggest historic emitter of carbon and the country with most responsibility for destroying our climate, fought tooth and nail for the science fiction of abatement to be included. For that, it received the colossal Fossil Award from the Climate Action Network of environmental activists, reserved for the biggest and baddest fossil at the conference. Another global effort that states are called on to contribute to is, quote, accelerating efforts globally towards net zero emission energy systems, utilising zero and low carbon fuels well before or by around mid-century. Net zero emissions again means carbon capture and storage, but also carbon offsetting, already exposed as a complete sham and a scam which simply doesn't work and makes some corporations even richer. Zero or low carbon fuels means continuing to use fossil fuels on the pretense that they are low carbon. Of course, there is no definition in the text of what low carbon means. Presumably even coal will count as being low carbon as long as it is abated with technologies that don't exist. And what does around mid-century mean? 2050, 2055, 2060? What sort of legal agreement has a non-specific deadline in it? What worker would be a fool to sign an employment contract that promises to pay them around the middle of each month? The clause that Minister Ryan and others are using to try to greenwash this historic sellout, this historic failure, is 28D, where states are, quote, called on to contribute, taking into account their different national circumstances, pathways and approaches to, quote, transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems so as to achieve net zero by 2050. Again, we have net zero, which means carbon offsetting, which means carbon capture and storage. Again, we have no specific binding target for any state, large or small, rich or poor. Without that, every capitalist government in the world can keep placing the burden on other capitalist governments to get to net zero. It's what we do here every time the Minister for Agriculture claims that if we didn't produce 90% of our beef for export, well then someone else would do it instead, and all that would happen would be that the Irish meat industry would lose out. It's the same version of what Sultan Al-Jaber was claiming with Mary Robinson, that don't worry, we have the lowest carbon, best fossil fuels on earth. It's that suicidal logic of global capitalist competition that is killing the climate. €1, $1, 1 degree at a time. And that's why it's vital that we don't just pass this motion today saying that the state should take the lead in joining with the many other states, small island nations, Latin American countries, European Parliament, World Health Organization, who have signed up to a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, but that the government now needs to act on this. I raised this yesterday with the Taoiseach, and he didn't know anything about it. He said, oh, we haven't been shown the text of it, when the point is the broad principles are out there and we're asking the Irish state to get involved in pushing it and in driving it, because very clearly the COP process has failed.